The Executive has correctly sought to prioritise education and the needs of our young people. Any disruption to schooling for a significant period of time will have a devastating impact on children's educational opportunities and future prospects, as well as being damaging to their mental health and well-being. No matter how well managed or provided, removal of face-to-face learning and its replacement with remote learning impacts on children's educational experience, with a disproportionate impact on disadvantaged groups and vulnerable children. It should therefore only be contemplated as a last resort in extreme public health circumstances such as we are facing, and should be maintained for a period no longer than is necessary. I brought forward a range of measures within education settings aimed at curbing the spread of COVID in Assembly statements on the 21st and 31st of December. These were produced following discussions with the Department of Health and cognizant of the requirement that schools could not reopen as normal in January. They included measures making face coverings compulsory in classroom settings in post-primary schools, increased enforcement of face coverings on school transport, work with the Department of Health on widening the usage of test and tracing within schools, improved visibility of signage to parents on school gates, and targeted messages to young people. Work has proceeded on these issues, and they will be ready to be implemented before any resumption of schools. More significantly, a package of measures had been introduced with regard to periods of remote learning. These were legally enacted on the 3rd of January and specifically required all mainstream schools and post-primary schools would conduct remote learning for pupils for the first week of term from the 4th to the 8th of January. Post-primary schools would be given some flexibility for face-to-face revision classes for the first week of term for students sitting GCSE exams in the second week of term. Pupils in years 8 to 11 would receive remote learning until the end of January. Vulnerable children and children of key workers, which would be where they are at least one parent as a key worker, would be facilitated at school for supervised learning. Special schools to remain open on usual dates and to reopen on the usual dates and to remain open. Preschool education settings to reopen on the usual dates and remain open. Childcare to remain open, and examinations required to be compliant with public health regulations. In light of the current crisis in public health, the following necessary actions agreed by the Executive yesterday by the Executive are proposed. I would say that this decision does not suggest that schools are no longer safe places for young people. Instead, limiting attendance is about reducing the number of contacts that all of us have with people in other households. So effectively, immediately, all mainstream education providers, including preschool education settings, primary and post-primary schools, are required to provide remote learning at home to their pupils rather than face-to-face teaching until the half-term break in the middle of February. Vulnerable children and children of key workers will have access to schools for supervised learning. Vulnerable children include, amongst others, all children with statements of special educational need. Children of key workers would require at least one parent to be a key worker. These are the same provisions as were put in place during the first lockdown and resulted in that occasion in a relatively small uptake in terms of places. Remote learning requirements and the removal of face-to-face teaching should be temporary and will last no longer than necessary, and therefore will be kept under review by the Executive. Special schools are to remain open as usual. I've also agreed that provision in lieu of free school meals will be made to those children entitled to free school meals while not normally in school. Childcare settings, including those based within primary schools, are to remain open, and childminders are also allowed to continue their provision. I've constantly said that my priority is to ensure that, if possible, exams could go ahead as planned. My overriding aim, however, is to ensure that our students are not disadvantaged in terms of their qualifications compared with learners in other jurisdictions, and takes account of the rapidly changing context in which our schools and pupils are having to operate. We must also provide equity between students completing exams under different examination boards from different jurisdictions. I previously stated that we are preparing for all eventualities, and I have asked CCEA to take work forward so that plans are ready to be activated in relation to the 2021 examination series should they be required. I now feel that we've reached a point where, while I still believe that examinations are the most appropriate and fairest way of fairest awarding methodology, with a further 6 weeks of remote learning having to be imposed, we cannot continue with exams in the way that was planned. I've therefore decided the following. All GCSE, AS and A2 exams due to take place in January, February, May and June will be cancelled. Work will continue on the alternative awarding arrangements and further details will be brought forward as soon as possible. Generic youth provision will move online under the discretion of management committees, and EA Youth Service will continue to lead on targeted provision for vulnerable and at-risk young people, including limited face-to-face work with mitigations in place to limit the spread of virus, where this is deemed appropriate, and to provide support under existing protocols to the PSNI. I would like to reiterate that these decisions have not been taken lightly, but we must have regard to the prevailing public health situation and the need to reduce overall community contacts. I wish to see schools return to face-to-face learning as soon as the public health situation permits.